I don't want women to have to beg to get out, and then when they get out, still have this residual guilt. No, you have been given a weapon. The body of Christ has been given a weapon to protect its members against people who I would argue are not part of it. And I want to see that start happening. That is my heart, that the body would be rid of its cancer.
I'm Todd, and I was naughty. I did everything wrong. I got kicked out of art school, I drank heavily, and I looked to other religions and versions of spirituality to get fulfilled. The problem was, I was in the occult and I didn't even know it. My life was a wreck, and I had to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
And I'm Laura. I was super nice. I did everything right. I got saved young, went to Moody Bible Institute, got married, and followed the Christian rules to having a good life. Problem was, that formula didn't work. I had to change how I related with Jesus.
At the end of the day, what I learned is the very simple truth. Jesus is the answer, and the only one that will ever actually fulfill you.
Naughty versus nice.
And welcome back to Naughty versus Nice, of course. I'm Todd.
And I'm Laura.
Well done.
Thank you.
Sometimes I wonder if you're ever going to start an episode without saying, of course, I'm Todd.
Oh, okay. How about let's do it now?
Let's try it. Okay, go ahead.
And welcome back to Naughty versus Nice. I'm Todd.
And of course, I'm Laura.
That's pretty good. Do I sound too bright and cheerful? Sometimes I feel like...
That doesn't last.
No,
it's
it
okay
doesn't.
if it's in the intro. You can
wait
just...
until I start yelling about something. I'm like, I'm a cranky old man.
Are we
So,
doing okay?
of course, we do have my lovely wife, Kelly, working the boards.
Woo-hoo.
And we are doing, yay, the subject every single Christian wants to talk about in thorough detail, divorce.
Yes. I'm excited. I feel like I need a cheerleading outfit. Yay! Sorry.
So one of those things, there's certain subjects, Christian, I was thinking about it today. Actually, I'm going to go from bright and happy to dark and dour.
All right, I'm ready.
It's almost as though when I was thinking, I was like, okay, how does the church actually view, like, what's a successful marriage? And it's gotten to the point where I feel like as long as you don't get divorced, your marriage is successful by definition. And there's so much more to it. There's such a, sorry to the divorced woman in the room, being married's awesome. It's a rich experience. You're missing out, But there's so much to it. There's so much going on. It's the opportunity to live your life in a way that you can't experience outside of it. And yet it seems to be, it doesn't matter what your marriage is like at home. It doesn't matter what's going on. As long as you stay married and don't get divorced, we're winning.
Well, and what's sad is I can think of a handful of marriages that are good and only a few that are exceptional. And usually you have to be quite a bit older than me to give the exceptional status to it because you've seen what it looks like over time. I would encourage people to look at the people they respect or their leadership and think about what their marriages look like, because that is the sad thing is we're protecting an image, but at the core of it, it's not often very pretty, and it's not a joyful place. It is a place where people would very much like to be out of it. I talk to mostly women who are in bad situations, but I have had a few come to me and they're just desperately unhappy. And I've encouraged them to stay, not in a bad relationship. They're just unhappy with their choice. And there's just certain answers I would give for that, to not just bail. But the problem is people don't work on this relationship. They just let it go.
And that comes to the point where it's the disclaimer. So we are talking about divorce, and that's just it. There's a difference between being unhappy in your marriage, you don't participate enough, you're not feeling fulfilled, sitting around watching your favorite TV show in utter silence and not talking to your spouse. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about different types of marriages, a smaller percentage of marriages that churches also seem to want to keep together. These are marriages that have abuse in them, that one of the two is abusive in nature, probably a personality disorder, probably something that's diagnosable. And the reason I would even go in that direction is that these behaviors seem to show up in a pattern over and over again, and they're predictable. Regular random people that are genuinely, kind of healthy and doing okay, but every now and then you're just like, I'm a little bit bored. You're not engaging in the same repetitious patterns, wash, rinse, repeat, push, pull, that kind of thing over and over again, the way that you're going to see it within abusive marriages.
And this is just kind of a little side note, disclaimer to the disclaimer. I have changed how I feel about divorce, obviously, over these pretty extreme situations. But I don't meet somebody who's divorced, and if I find out I don't think they meet that criteria, it does not change how I feel about them. I know that sounds weird, but I almost just want to love them more because they're not being supported on some level. I'm not saying go out and divorce her, and I'm just saying there's so many layers to marriages falling apart, and sometimes there is a place in between the normal and the psycho that is two people who together it's not working well. It's hurting them, and it doesn't have to fit these black and whites. I just want to put that out there because I think in general, unless you meet these firm standards of, the Bible, everybody kind of is uncomfortable with you if you've divorced. And so if you're in that situation, you can, email me and I'll be your friend. That's what I'm saying. Because I cannot look at somebody and be like, oh, well, you did it for the wrong reason. If you were 20 years old and you're like, I just changed my mind, I'd be like, okay, I have a real problem with that one. But other stuff, I get it. It's fair. I've seen people in very destructive marriages that aren't psycho. So I just want to put that out there.
Paul goes out after spending 3 years in, I guess, like a heavenly realm of some kind, getting specifically taught by Jesus, goes out and kind of kickstarts the church. The other disciples do that as well. Paul really goes out and starts reaching the Gentiles. He's going out to help build that body of Christ, to build that bride for Christ. And Paul's attitude, the way that he goes about doing it, there is a joyfulness in it. There is a rejoicing in it because it's not just the work of it. It's part of that relationship in directly going back to Christ. There is a part of marriage where it is showing up in the world like that relationship that Christ has with the bride. We want to honor that. We want to respect that. We don't want to treat it like garbage. We don't want to, like it's a used Kleenex and we just put it on the coffee table and leave it there, for whatever. I ran away with that one. But my point is that so you have this situation where Paul's going out and he's engaging in that. And the church, to use that as the platform for it, when the church is encouraging that a woman stay in an abusive situation or unwilling to listen to what she has to say regarding it and try to be encouraging, as you say, it's like Jesus is just wringing his hands in the corner of the room watching this horror unfold before him. And he's just like, I just hope we can keep the marriage together. That is not Paul. Paul's not out there harming other people in the name of Christ. Paul's not out there abusing people in the name of Christ. In doing it in that capacity, it's done with love. It's done with joyfulness. It's done with glee. He's so excited to be participating in this master plan and having it unfold. That's the image that I really want to kind of communicate. So when we talk about these horrors that go on and the reasons, there are biblical reasons for divorce. We're not talking about the happy and the good. We're talking about the horror and the nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready to talk about the horror and the nightmare?
Let's do it. Okay. Or did we do too long on the opening?
No. I just was like, well, let's go then. We talked about last week, we just built the framework of what Moses said in the law, through God. God, through Moses, said in the Mosaic Law about divorce, and the provisions he made in Exodus 21 were very much in favor of the protection of women in that culture against neglectful behavior. And that wasn't just he came home and threw $1 at her and then she was good. It covered every part of relationship. So I want to remind people of that because that is the one section no one goes to. They'll say the two places in Scripture that talk about divorce are Matthew and Corinthians. And it's like, there's more. So building on that, knowing that the law was given as a guidebook of loving relationship between the Father and the Son, and Jesus fulfills the law in that relationship. So the law is not just gone in its intent, in its heart, in its character. So we can still look at that and go, look, here God provided to protect women, and not only that, but he allowed for her to enter into another covenant. He did not consider one marriage not dissolvable over all time, that she was held to. That isn't a concept that is embraced in that culture, at least in that time, in that place in the Bible. So moving forward, I'd hinted at that there's a seeming disagreement between what Jesus says about the reason for divorce and what Paul says. And so I kind of want to break down both of those different passages. One's going to be Matthew 19 and the other's 1 Corinthians 7, I believe. So there's kind of one. Did everybody else assume in the Old Testament times that no one got a divorce? Like that divorce is like since the 50s was this new thing? Or
Yeah, I don't
me?
think I realized. I thought that
It was
until-
rampant. Like
Yeah.
Jewish culture, they divorced all the time up until the time Jesus is around. This isn't unheard of. Like the 1950s model of the man and woman stay together, it's kind of something that's imprinted in my mind as that must be the biblical idea. I don't know why. Not 1950s. Anyway, divorce has kind of a historical pattern. So you have in Israel's history, as things plodded along, the Exodus 21 passage was their guidance for civil divorce. That's what they went by. But I'm checking my notes because I'm trying to see where it happens. They move. So these grounds for divorce based on Exodus 21 were in use until about AD 70. That's when the temple's destroyed too. But by the time that Jesus was preaching in about 30 AD, so 40 years earlier, they were being used only rarely. So you have up until about the time Jesus is being born, this is the practice. And then there's a guy that comes on the scene around the time, I think it might be a decade or two, I'll look at the notes, before Jesus' ministry or Jesus' birth. I can't remember. There's a rabbi named Hillel, and he takes I think it's Deuteronomy 21, where Moses is allowing for divorce, and he says something along the lines of any cause, and then he says for sexual immorality, any cause. It's very clear from that, and the way that the nation had practiced that up until that point was he's talking about a man divorcing a wife over sexual immorality. Hillel's argument is, well, why would he allow for divorce in that situation when that's a punishable offense, like by death, by stoning, adultery? And so he kind of, I don't know how, works it up that it's going to actually mean any cause. So by the time Jesus is walking around, this philosophy is at war between two groups. You've got now I have to check. You've got Hillel, and his opposing is Shammai, probably saying that wrong. Shammai would be the traditional Exodus 21 reasons. But Hillel wants to take it, and did, and so at Jesus' time, a Jewish man could decide, the joke is he could decide the pot roast was burnt, and you're done. It was immediately, you're divorced. You don't have a plea. There's no reason for any cause. The man, not the woman, for any cause, he could boot her in a second, and then she's out on her own. So
wasn't it something like he just had to write it on a slip of paper and hand it to her or something like that?
I'm going to check, because that actually, there's a theme of that with this movement. And then when Paul talks about divorce in 1 Corinthians, that is the Roman culture as well. They're very similar. They're groundless.
Well, I guess the point that I'm trying to make, it's not a 1.5 year long battle through the courts. It doesn't cost you $50,000 and, your receding hairline. It literally is just a super simple, easy thing. If you're a man, you write it on a piece of paper, and just kind of throw her away like a parking ticket.
And even in Exodus, when it's given and the way it was practiced according to the law, it wasn't a legal thing the same way it is now, like this drawn out thing. It was, she could petition the civil system or the courts, however you want to put it, and then give reason, and then he would have to write her a certificate of divorce. That's what it would be. So there was a formality to it. There wasn't the process, but she had to have reason, or he did. So that, there are certain things that if she were doing the same thing, if she weren't providing in the home and, all that kind of stuff we talked about last time, then he could also request that as well. It's just more typical. The woman was left in a position of not being able to do that in that culture.
Yeah.
So now you have Matthew 19, and you have to keep in mind that type of divorce is called any cause. That's how he, in quotes, that was how he called it. The divorce
Hillel.
Hillel. Thank you. Yes, very good to clarify. You can just kick her out for nothing. And so divorce is happening left and right because there's no lid on it, is kind of the thing. So then you come along and you have the Pharisees come to Jesus in Matthew 19, and they're going to ask this question about divorce and marriage. And he's going to answer it, and it's going to sound like what we've all heard, but keeping in mind that there's a cultural setting to it now. So I want to ask if you have any thoughts, Todd, before I keep talking.
No, see, that's the part with most of it. when you take one or two verses out of context without letting the wider part of what's going on, it's possible to miss certain things. I'm not saying with everything. There are some things that are super clear, but there's a whole cultural context of what's going on, a whole historical context of what's going on. So it's not as cut and dry, as black and white as so many of us wish it was. It becomes more complex, and there is reading between the lines, or I shouldn't even say that, more nuance with understanding the overarching thing of what's going on. You got two Pharisees coming up to Jesus. They're trying to kill him, or trying to trap him, or trying to shame him. I don't know if they're up to the point where they're plotting to kill him yet, but this is a trap. They're walking up to him to try to spring a trap on him and wedge him in between two very hot-button, controversial issues and topics, and they're trying to position Jesus so he's got to pick one over the other.
Yes, and basically in that decision or in that answer gain a new group of people opposing him.
But exactly. He's going to get ostracized by half and then probably celebrated by the other half. Sound familiar? You know what I mean? It's like some things just in culture don't change.
No. They do not. So I'm in Matthew 19, 3 through 12. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" So in some translations, it'll say any cause. And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So here he's drawing attention back to the original intent of Adam and Eve. In that culture, it's going to return the standard to one wife, one husband, because polygamy had faded some, but everything I found online is saying that it was still present. It wasn't as strong as in the beginning of the nation. But so he's drawing it back to the beginning. He's reinforcing the original intent of creation. So then verse 6, he says, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." So people hear this and they hear no man can separate. And it's the instruction is this is something sacred, and so we don't just separate it on a whim. But that I've heard people say this and turn it a little and help you think about it differently. That instruction is also to the husband and wife. So you don't do something to separate yourself from your spouse by creating a groundwork that leads to it, basically. Verse 7, they said to him, "Why then command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" That's from the Exodus 21. Send away means to give her a divorce without her receiving repercussion. That wasn't like just throw her out the door. Verse 8, he said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way." So I read this to be saying, yes, at the beginning before the fall, this was the perfect intention and design, but sin enters in, so now we got a different situation. "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." So this is where everyone goes. And so especially my mom was married once, and then he cheated on her within a year and a half. They divorced. He wanted to get remarried in the Catholic Church, and he came, and his dad came to petition her to say that they had never had sex and to annul the marriage so he could get married in the Catholic Church. I'm proud of her. She said no. But yeah, she said that's not even real. But that is where this is coming from. There's this idea that, because that kind of got lobbed at my mom and dad at times. I remember hearing this and saying, well, my dad married a divorced woman. They're not really married. He's committing adultery. She's committing adultery. It makes no sense. Or, but this is where this comes from, this idea. So he's just said, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples said to him, "If the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, is it better not to marry?" So
they're sweating.
My guest was here. I was like, there's different people have different commentary. They say, well, they just thought that sounded too hard to be married to just one woman, or they thought it was too hard to have no other outlet, like to get out of marriage except for immorality. So
I would even go, they've seen Jesus kind of one up the standard a few times, and it starts getting to the point where it becomes clear God's law, or what God requires of us, is impossible. And, you've got a situation where he's about to serve it up. And so they're all just going, oh man, what's he about to say?
And then he goes on to talk about eunuchs. So I'm not going to go into that. I forgot that. I'm like, do we need that verse? I don't know. The point of the passage is to read it through a different lens. So now you have these two groups of people basically trying to trap him. They say, do you think that a man can leave his wife for any cause? And he returns, he enforces creation, he enforces the law, which was given in order to protect people in situations of neglect. He upholds that still, and then he says to the man, he may not divorce except for sexual morality and marry another. It means he's talking about the men who were doing that, the men who were just flippantly leaving. He's saying, no, you have to return back to the law. The law was in infidelity, then no. But that's the hard line for him in this discussion, because he's witnessing men disregarding wives left and right for no reason at all. And that's what he's answering. Does that make sense? Does that make it seem different than what you've heard?
Well, it's a simple way would be the whole women shouldn't talk in church thing. Mm-hmm. It's Paul talking about a specific church with a specific issue. They had a problem with gossip. It was tearing the church apart on the inside out. And so he's like, look, you just stop talking. And so that's not all women all throughout history, all throughout time. Specific instance, specific situation, specific set of circumstances. He's addressing their specific issue and specific question. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He knows they're trying to trap him. He knows they're trying to put him between a rock and a hard place. And he knows that the cultural significance of what's going on, let alone he probably also knows we're going to be talking about this so many, thousands of years later, trying to parse out and understand, well, let's get as close as we can to what he is talking about, what he really means. Once again, I'm not saying I think we can all agree. We're not in favor of divorce. We're not saying this is the first option. We're saying it's definitely, it's on the table, but not, I don't know. That probably all needs to be re-edited. I'm not saying it's off the table, as my wife is looking at me.
She's like, yeah, it is.
I'm getting folded over my words. So it's just, it's a context thing.
So now I have all these notes written out. I'm bad at this because then I'm like, I just would rather read it all so I make sure I say everything. But I do have one paragraph, and I think it sums up this passage. Jesus' answer appeals to God's original intentions towards the sanctity of marriage. So remember that the original design prefigures his own marriage relationship with the church. So he's drawing honor to the covenant. He then saying if a man divorces his wife except for infidelity, he is guilty of adultery, is really saying he, the husband, who is being unlawful in the ending of the marriage, is not then free to move on willy-nilly and marry another. If he were to do so, that first marriage is not nullified by such low standards, and the man is not to be considered free to move on to another marriage. He would not be considered legally divorced according to the Mosaic law. I find it very interesting that when we looked at Adam and Eve and the creation of that and what that modeled, that was our picture for what a successful, quote, marriage is we want to protect that kind of relationship where we see what kind of love is given, especially from a husband to a wife in his care for her. We see it in Adam and Eve in their prefigurement of Christ in the church. Now we have this picture, and he's upholding that. And then even by admonishing these men, he's still upholding that. So to me, that changes the whole passage, because I didn't find the book. We'll give the links to the book. There's 2 books, actually, that talk about this. I didn't know this. And so I would read these passages and just feel condemnation because I'm like, oh, gosh, I don't know. I don't know how to get around it. It's what he says. But it's cultural. It's in context of something, but it's also principles. That's what we lose sometimes. We're like, well, it's just this. This is the only reason. But there's a principle here. What is he protecting? What does he value in this relationship? What is he drawing you back to? Those things matter, and we can't divorce those from the text. Do you like that?
Well,
thank you. Thank you. I was waiting.
Well, I want to jump in on this too, because like I was saying, there's multiple levels of things that are going on here. And one of the ways that you can see this, obviously we talked about it before, briefly mentioning there is the association between Christ and the body and the church and that marriage of that bride. So there's that level of what's going on here too. And then when we take into and put into context the words that are being used, and this is going to be Strong's 420 or 4202, porneia, which is where we get the word porn from. The definition that everybody kind of colloquially had at the time would be sexual immorality or fornication. So it's outside of sexual immorality, porneia, which we would know is, okay, fooling around, okay, yada, 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 that kind of thing. But it also means idolatry. There is a spiritual context that I think is a double layer that's also going on here. If Jesus was talking about burritos, it wouldn't be there. But he's not. He's talking about marriage and the church. All of a sudden, there's that spiritual context, especially with his bride. Hasn't been formed yet, but it's going to be. So now we take a look and we see that origin of that word comes from porne, which, if I'm even pronouncing that right, it's a Greek word, which means prostitute or harlot. And the Hebrew equivalent associated with porneia often refers to an act of unfaithfulness, harlotry, both physically as well as spiritually. So now we see this additional layer, the shadow and type of what was going on with what we talked about with Malachi last week, and how God's like, look, I hate divorce. Stop doing this, guys, or we're going to get divorced. And what were they doing? They were being unfaithful. They were being harlotrous. They were engaging in idolatry, spiritual unfaithfulness, unclean behavior. They were engaging in porneia. With all the gods and goddesses that were out there. So in accordance with a form of speech common in the Old Testament, in my notes here, and among the Jews, which represents the closest relationship existing between Jehovah and his people, under the figure of marriage is used metaphorically the worship of idols. Porneia is the word used in Revelation for the whore of Babylon. So now we have that direct association. It's not just we have this figure that, through the revelation of John while he's on Patmos, the idea of the whore of Babylon, it's directly associated with the concept of marriage, with what Jesus is talking about here. Who is his church? It's the bride. Who is the whore of Babylon? It is the harlot, or it is the unbride. It looks like a bride, says it's a bride, acts like a bride, but it's harlotress. It's not a bride. So there's, like I say, multiple layers of what's going on here within context of what's happening. This is not just a cut and dry, hey, Jesus, quick question. Could guys get divorced? And Jesus is like, shabam, no, look, read the law, yo. You know what I mean? It's not that, I don't know. That's all I had. But it's just not as cut and dry and not as simple. This is contextually layered. And when people go to this verse, they pull out of it, you can't get divorced unless fornication. Mm-hmm. There's way more going on here.
I agree. And I think that might fit in with Hillel's question about the law in Deuteronomy 21, saying that a man is not allowed to for any cause except for this, blah, 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 is because he was saying, how can that be that the law says if a woman commits adultery, she's to be stoned, but then you turn around and say in this situation that he can just divorce her? Well, one, principles again, not every single person who committed adultery in Israel was stoned. That's just not what happened. It is in the law. Whether or not that was the decided on outcome was, I think, case to case. That was part of the law. It functioned within a governing too. But I think that's where he got that from. But if you read and understand the sexual immorality as being something more than that, one of the books I read talked about it. It's an unfaithfulness, which can take many faces, like what you're just saying. So. Now we're going to talk about Paul.
Do this.
I love Paul.
Let's do this.
He's my favorite.
he's a goody two-shoes too, isn't he?
No, he's like hard lines. I like him. My son hates, well, he doesn't hate him, but he likes to pretend that he just doesn't like Paul because, you know why, right? Because I like him. That's his whole goal in life, is just to oppose anything that I like. And he never listens. I can say anything I want because he hasn't listened for a long time. He's losing points. All right, we're talking about stars. No stars for him. We're talking about Paul. So Paul is the one thing we remember about Paul in divorce is he says that it's only in the case of if someone has physically abandoned you. So how that was explained to me in all of my Christianity was that he physically has to pack up his bag and say, I'm done with you, woman, and leave the house, and then that was an out for you, which I've only met one woman in my whole life who's had a guy actually do that, and he really did just leave, and she was like, oh, this worked out pretty well. So Anywho, so what is the climate of Corinth? So what's going on in Corinth is you've got Romans and you've got Jews, and both of them exist under kind of a compulsion to marry, because in the Jewish culture, the original command was to, go forth and multiply. And then in the Roman culture, they were encouraging marriage because they wanted legitimate Roman sons, and they wouldn't consider that outside of marriage. And so marriage is a hot topic, I guess you could say. In Rome, at the time that Paul's writing this, the way you divorced, I want to read it because I'm trying to make sure I don't get this wrong. So, okay, I got it. There was an easy remedy. Their partner could divorce them immediately and without any difficulty using Roman divorce by separation. This was possible because Corinth was run under Roman law, and even Jews could choose to use a Roman divorce if they wished. The Roman divorce was very easy. All you had to do was walk out of the house if your partner owned it, or tell your partner to get packing and leave the house if you owned it. So that would be, in most cases, a woman who would separate and a man who would dismiss. That's going to be important later. I hope you can tell by my dramatic voice. So there was no need to cite any grounds for ending the marriage, and having separated, you were both legally divorced and free to remarry. The problem was that divorce in Corinth was too easy. You did not need any good reason to get divorced, or in fact any reason at all. You could walk out on an innocent and loving partner, or you could even throw them out of the house if you owned it. There's also added to the climate of the passage is there's people living in Rome and they're getting saved, and they're concerned that now that they're saved, they shouldn't be married to an unbeliever. And so they were practicing this law and walking out. That's going to be helpful, I hope, and when we read the Corinthians passage. Do you have any comments? Because I'm hearing my voice a lot. So
No, I actually had these verses set aside too, as well, and had a different commentary for it. But let's get to what you're talking about and the key kind of point, and then I'll throw in my 2 cents if it's,
unless it contradicts me. And then, please don't.
Has that ever stopped Todd?
No,
better tonight. All right, 1 Corinthians 7. Now, concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Let's just stop there. That's an interesting passage. 1, Paul is giving us an indicator. He is writing about something they wrote him. So this is about a specific issue. We don't know what that is, but it is important to remember that. This is where some commentators are like, well, is he being negative about marriage? Or are his responses going to be negative? No, it's one, he gets positive as he goes, but there's also a famine in the land, and so it's question if that might be a part of his tone in some things, because the more marriage, the more children, the more mouths to feed. I don't know. That was just one thing I read. All right, verse 2. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. I did not look into it, but this has always been taught to me as duty is a sexual relationship. So if I'm wrong about that, people can write in. Nobody ever writes in, so I like saying that because no one's going to write in.
Well, I hear it referred to over and over again regarding this, especially with couples about to get married within certain, insular communities inside the Christian community itself. So there, in my opinion, that this tends to get emphasized, whereas other things regarding marriage tend to get de-emphasized. And it usually seems to be emphasized kind of more in one direction over another, so to speak. You know what I mean? Almost like the whole idea, well, her body's not her own. I get to do whatever I want with it. It's like, no, dude, that is not it. That's not it.
Well, and I think, too, to look at something like the sexual relationship of a marriage and separate it from the entirety of it is just not how God works anyway. So for Paul to be addressing this and saying the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, 1, this is uncommon. Everything in that culture is the woman is for the man. So everything Paul writes, we just overlook that all the time because of our culture. But this is lots of revolutionary statements are being made by Paul about women in the New Kingdom. And so he's going to go on in verse 4 and say the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So they belong to one another. They aren't in a hierarchy. And so the sexual relationship, as it demonstrates the health of the entire relationship should reflect those ideas. And it returns to the ideas of Adam and Eve that you love your wife at great sacrifice to yourself. You love your husband at great sacrifice to yourself. That's kind of the goal. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Depriving has a tone of stop keeping something from someone that they rightfully deserve, but you keep out of some misguided sense of propriety. So we see this and we're like, well, that means that a wife can never say no. No, these were new believers unsure of how to apply their Christianity to their sexual relationship in marriage. I'm assuming that's what the flavor is here. So it was more of an idea that it's not bad. And so you need to be mindful of one another, all of those things, but that's the context.
Well, it's everybody always just assumes it's just sex, as though that's all marriage is. Mm-hmm. There's so much more. You can deprive your wife or you can deprive your husband of attention, of compassion, of even just listening to them. Whatever it is, there are multiple different ways in which this can show up that can also damage and harm a marriage. It's not the same as, hanging out having wings with your bros. If like a buddy of mine deprives me of something like that, doesn't even make any sense. It's within this intimate relationship, in the confines of this intimate, unique situation that is very, very personal. That's the place where you can deprive anybody or your spouse of anything and harm them and cause them stress, cause them damage as a way of trying to goad them into a behavior or punish them, for example, for not doing what you want. And I think that there's a much wider context of what's going on here. It's not just sexual.
Could it be that it's more about principles?
Huh?
Okay.
Could it be?
Is that too obvious? Okay.
A little too on the nose.
Verse 6, but this I say by way of concession, not of command. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So this is understood to be, he's not saying that everyone must do as he is. This is his thought. It's not a command from the Lord, but he thinks it is of great value to remain single because Paul is not married, at least at the point that he's in ministry. But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. Again, huge statement. That's against Roman culture. It's against Jewish culture. Women didn't remain unmarried. Widows didn't remain unmarried. He's saying that's okay. In the new kingdom, this is how things go. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Again, this is often, the couples are like, should we get married? We're not really ready, but we're burning with passion. Sorry, that's how that verse is always, I always think of that. But okay, verse 10, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate her from her husband. So most translations will say separate. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. So if you're reading it in context, his instruction is that if you have or are thinking of taking part of the walk out the door Roman type of divorce, you should return or abstain from continuing. So the encouragement is that if she has left, she should not marry and seek to return. Likewise, she should not marry, but seek to return. Likewise, a man should not ask her to leave. So he's speaking to this walkout divorce. He's saying, like I said earlier, women wouldn't have owned the property, so she would have separated and left. He would have dismissed her.
And not only that, but the wider context, once again, is the idea. Paul's addressing the concept of one of you is a believer and the other one isn't. And so there's this other layer that's going on top here. And you're like, look, I don't know what to do. I believe my husband doesn't. I guess there's nothing to be done. I should just get out of here and just go find a good Christian man. Paul's like, whoa. He's like, hold on. The ease of divorce, the whole situation, you're jumping the gun way too much. There's a whole lot that needs to be discussed and talked about within the confines of your marriage before you just willy-nilly go jumping out the door. And so, yeah, in this context, I'm in agreement with Paul.
That's always a good place to be. Because it's, inspired scripture and all that. Verse 12, but to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. So again, he's speaking to this discussion. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. This is further addressing the misconception that the early church, Corinth, was struggling with, now that I'm saved, should I not be married to the unbeliever? For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. I'm just going to tell everyone listening right now, I'm not going there tonight. That is another whole discussion. So I'm including it because I don't like reading passages and just cutting out verses that I don't want to address, but I'm not addressing that right now. 15, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So this is what I was taught, is if your husband physically abandoned you, it was only allowed to be a divorce situation if he had been an unbeliever. So in my case, if my husband had left, physically abandoned me, I couldn't divorce him. That's how this is taught.
You know what I found interesting listening to you read the verses is Paul says if she consents, then say if he consents. That means it's mutual. That's a two-way street. That's not one person having complete domination over another.
Well, that doesn't seem biblical. Kelly, take that back. No, just kidding. We're bitter having been taught weird things. So sorry.
I don't know. I just seem to remember Paul saying something about women talking. So.
Okay, well, actually, this woman has more to say. Because I have another question listening to you read that. So Paul is saying that the Romans and the Jews were both rushing to marry again. So he's like, no, you can stay single, right? So why do people say that if you divorce, you can't marry? If that's clearly something that was going on, that was,
Because they don't understand. Like, there's too many places with Exodus being one of them. I know people are going to say, well, it's Old Testament law, it doesn't matter. But she was allowed to divorce in order to remarry. It was the expectation here in Paul's writing and in his culture that they would divorce and remarry. The woman at the well, when he says, you tell the truth, you've had 5 husbands or whatever, he doesn't say 1 husband and 4 lovers. Marriage wasn't considered like this eternal bond that now could never be broken or reestablished with someone else. That's just something I think we've read into it.
It's the church culture. It's something that has developed over time. Everybody's heard it. Nobody knows exactly where it's at. We start fitting it into the Bible, and next thing you know, that's the lens through which we always look through. Every time we go to the Bible regarding this topic, that's the lens that's automatically popped up. We don't even know that it's there. And so we read everything through that filter, and we're constantly adjusting things in order to make it fit to a 2025 modern Western post-Enlightenment context.
Yeah, and that's what I believed. So I'm only throwing like tiny pebbles. I'm not throwing rocks at anyone in judgment. That's a joke. You're supposed to laugh.
Oh, I was just imagining
it's a tough crowd.
Yeah, no, I thought you were like lobbing some pretty good pebbles, and I was like, oh, we're gonna have to do a podcast series where I'm just pushing a boulder off a cliff into the water,
Oh, okay. So back to verse 15, which I did already read, but I'm going to read it again. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister, so the one who's being left by this unbeliever, is not under bondage in such cases. That's where that rule came from when people are reading it. But God has called us to peace. I find it very interesting that his principle here has been made a law. The idea is that if one is ready to leave and there is nothing you can do, you need to let that happen. And I don't mean like just willy-nilly. You know that. This is interesting to me, though, that we have Kelly says this all the time, we have the unwaveringly good ability. That's the only thing I can say. I can't think of the right sentence. The church is the best at making a rule out of a principle.
Oh, yeah. We put Jesus in a box.
And if we can make it a law, we're going to make it a law.
Yes.
And so... All right, so verse 16, for how do you know, a wife, whether you will save your husband? Again, I'm not going to go there tonight, guys. Or how do you know, a husband, whether you will save your wife? Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each in this manner, let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. His idea, the full context of Romans 7 is remain, if possible, in the state you were called in. So if you were married when you got saved, stay married. If you were not married and you're fine with that, then stay single. That's pretty much where he kind of goes on from there. He'll go on through 18, 19, I think 20, and he starts talking about other things. So hopefully in understanding that, it becomes a little bit more clear what really in specific and what in principle Paul is talking about. He's speaking into a very specific situation of a culture, of what's happening. That isn't happening anymore. But what Paul said has principle. What are the principles I think exist in that as we address marriage and divorce? I think it would be, one, if you are a believer married to an unbeliever, there is something in that in God's design that can be redemptive. And so there should be a faithfulness there. There shouldn't be a desertion of marriage over such an issue. Then there's the idea that the woman could separate and the man could dismiss. And he's saying, if you do that, you should, if she has left willy-nilly, she's walked out, she should not remarry. She should not consider that under that Roman law she's divorced. And if a man has dismissed her in that same manner, he shouldn't go on and marry. They should seek to reconcile if possible. Because this wasn't like we have deep-rooted issues. This was people walking out left and right. I don't know. Does that change, that framework change how you've heard that passage?
I think so. And I think that it's kind of like you had said before at one point, marriage itself, in a weird sort of way, has become its own idol. It's somehow we've leveraged it or pushed it out to a point where somehow we're making God cry if we don't marry correct or if we get divorced. Not if you go home and tune up your wife. Not if you go home and treat her like garbage and tell her she's worthless. Not if she is psychologically abusing you or is saying you're insufficient in whatever way. And not if you're constantly getting harmed, cajoled, and manipulated for a 20, 30-year period. That's not a failure. That's not something the church looks at and goes, we really messed up, guys. It's if you divorce your abuser, now we got a problem, guys, and we can't let the rest of the world see that we're just like them while you ignore problems like everybody else. You know kind of what I'm saying? I'm like, I know I'm hard on it, and I'm not trying to be mean or judgy or a jerk about this whole thing. It's just that, how can we sit around and say that we love people, we only want to tell them the truth, and we don't mean to hurt people, and that's why we deliver the gospel, and these truths are uncomfortable, and all we want them to do is change their entire life in order to live in accordance with the truth that we've already accepted. But yet, we have these truths facing us in front of the church, and you don't have to, and it's unthinkable to have a situation where somebody would have to change just a little bit in order to accommodate the truth of that. You know kind of what I'm saying? It's not, and then you get to this part where you go, who is Jesus mad at the most? It wasn't really the tax collectors. It wasn't even Pontius Pilate, and it really wasn't the government. It really wasn't. It was the religious leaders of the time that were operating in a hypocritical capacity. Okay, and that's not everybody, obviously. I believe that most people within the church, they genuinely want to do good. They genuinely believe they're called to do it, and they genuinely want to serve the people that are there. But we have to pay attention to and live within the truth of the way that things are done, not adopt church culture, not adopt Christianity TM, and then flex it on other people and behave as though they're acting immorally because they're not obeying something we made up that we got off the back of a greeting card or something.
Well, and I think in a way to be fair to the people I've encountered the most in the church, when we're dealing with these two reasons, they almost feel torn because they know they're hearing these stories and these things happening, and they're like, "This is bad. It's not right," and yet they're really conflicted because they have a loyalty to what they think and have been taught is the absolute truth. And I understand that because that is where I was. And it, like I said, all of a sudden, that article I read, if you go back to week 1 when I read that article, it was, we don't want to presume on the word of God. Maybe some of these other things would be grounds, perhaps, almost, but it was like that attitude, and it was like we're so afraid of these two passages. And I kind of wanted to explain them so people can go, oh, wait. Now, and if you question it, you're like, well, this sounds like she's making it up to say what she wants. I have 2 books. She's going to give you the link. There's more. These people, the one guy that I love, I think it's David Instone Brewer. He is a Jewish, he just studied. That was his whole dissertation, everything is just Jewish culture. And he's very readable, very easy handbook for people to read if they want to kind of get some ideas about this stuff. Adding to your idea, though, about how things sit in the church and how they weigh things, we aren't under the law. I'm not saying this is what should happen, and I'm not judging people for what has happened. But when you ask pastors, would a man divorced be unqualified to be in leadership? A lot of the times they're like, yeah, but we'd want to look into it, and that's fair. I think that's fair. But according to the Mosaic law, if you were in a situation where divorce was required, you were protected under the law and allowed to remarry, especially for the women in that culture, right? Sexual infidelity, so any sex outside of marriage. So that would be marriage. If you married Susan, but you had sex with Susan before she was married, that's considered fornication. It's considered unlawful. You have sex with somebody you've not covenanted with. That's unlawful. You have sex with somebody else that's covenanted to someone else. That's unlawful. So that was all comes together under adultery, and they stoned you for adultery. But you don't find that people are asking, when they're figuring out qualifications for leadership, what was your sexual history with your wife before you married her? What was your sexual history with other women before you married her? Have you ever looked at pornography? Have you ever had an affair? Like, I'm assuming the having an affair one, people would be like, yeah, you're not qualified. Mm-hmm. But and I'm not saying that's the discussion that needs to happen. I'm just saying, do you see, like, when God is outlining in his law what he is valuing in covenant, it is protection and faithfulness. And the woman who is asking to be rescued from a situation is appealing to a law that is protecting her. But the person who is faithless is the one that's receiving the harsher judgment. But we hold a different standard to people in the church. Does that make sense? I don't mean it like we got to stone people. I think it's important to think about the heart behind why those things had the repercussions they did.
Because it has resonating consequences throughout the way that you conduct yourself, especially as a church, how you go about choosing and picking leadership, and what type of body you want to build. Correct. And I also want to even throw another layer on top, since we're not done criticizing the church yet. When you look at the only two acceptable reasons in modern church culture of, Paul says it's for abandoning your wife, and Jesus says it's for sexual immorality. I don't know. How about beating your kids? Mm-hmm. How come that's not included in there? You see what I'm saying? So it's like, that's an obvious one, a no-brainer. If you've got some guy coming home, after stopping by, the local watering hole, getting home from work, and maybe he's not, harming his wife in all the horrible ways, but maybe he's beating up on the kids, and that kind of thing. According to the way that church culture operates today, that would be also a wring your hand moment of, I don't know, guys. I mean, I guess you're just going to have to get beat up for the next 15 years before we can do anything. I can appreciate the idea of, like we have talked about before, that you're in a situation where leadership is not going to be supportive to you when they say, he hasn't done anything yet. She hasn't done anything yet. Nothing's happened to you yet. Even if something's happened, still nothing's happened. You know kind of what I'm saying? Because the line of that, the goalposts on that get pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And I can appreciate it. Don't get me wrong. I like the idea of innocent until proven guilty. I do. I think we need a court system that operates that way. I think we need a judicious system that operates that way. It really, really, really matters. It really, really, really is important. But the church is not the court, and the church aren't the cops. And at a certain point, there's a distinction between the idea of the civil process by which govern a people, so that you just can't point a finger, make an accusation, they get thrown in prison for 20 years without a trial, versus why is your 9-year-old daughter wearing long sleeve shirts in July? Why did your wife not show up to church this week, but the week before, it looked like she wore a little heavy eye makeup, if you know what I mean. Whatever the situation, there's a very hands-off approach when it comes to most people within the body, and we get the mandate: live with each other, get integrated with lives, share meals with each other, really live and sink in. That's the body. That's the experience. And the way that we're conducting ourselves today, they don't line up in many ways. This is one of the glaring examples of ways. There are others, of course, but it's just, guys, like, if not women and kids getting hurt, like, what's your line, you know?
And I think adding to the idea, the body is important. We are not three individuals who sit around and we think the church needs to be deconstructed, or we need to give up on going to church.
No.
Nothing like that. But what years and years and years ago, a student pastor, I'll call him because he wasn't the head pastor, I don't know what to call him, he said, can you grow if you live on an island by yourself as a Christian? Can you grow and you have your Bible? And I thought, well, yeah. And he said, no, you can't. You require the body. This isn't something that we can just take out. But I would agree, I think we've listened to so many podcasts lately. I think it was Diane Langberg said there's cancer in the body, and the body cannot function with cancer in it. And so when I hear, there are multiple stories that have been told to me of women who have been in physically abusive, like it's an obvious one. They're being beaten, and they don't think they can leave. And finally, somebody in their family or a pastor or something has said, you know, I wouldn't want my daughter to go through this, so I just think that, yeah, it's okay. And then they're like relieved because they can't get that from the church as a legal thing, though. Do you see how faulty that is? So if someone had said to me, as black and white as I am, as committed to scriptural principles as I am, if they had said, I just can't see that God would have you be treated this way. As committed as I am, that's not enough, because that feels like feelings to me. You know, I need to know I can do it. And so I want very much earlier than the woman coming to the final person who tells her she can leave bruised, I want the church to start to know what it looks like before it happens, and then be able to give a woman this content and this heart of God and this view of marriage in order that she can leave. And she doesn't feel like it's like, well, I guess I got out because, Grandpa said it was okay, or, somebody nice. I'm just thinking of my dad. So I don't want women to have to beg to get out. And then when they get out, still have this residual guilt. No, you have been given a weapon. The body of Christ has been given a weapon to protect its members against people who I would argue are not part of it. And I want to see that start happening. That is my heart, that the body would be rid of its cancer. And so I think we all think, maybe we're just so negative. But we are, I feel like these thoughts are like Jeremiah. The bulk of the community that we're surrounded by, as far as the American church, is not saying these things. We are not functioning well. And so I think it's important to kind of be, on the corner with our bullhorns or whatever. So that kind of does lead to what I want to cover next week. I would like to create a couple of different lists, and one would be I'm going to go with women because it's my expertise, what a woman should look for as signs that she's in an abusive relationship. It's not obvious. I have talked with women who are physically hurt and still don't think they describe it as abusive. So I want to list some things, and then I'd like to list things that I would like church leadership to look for and to understand what they're looking at. And then I've asked Todd to come up with things from the flip side, ways you can start to recognize that a wife might be the abusive one in the home, because we excuse a lot of bad behavior from women in these kinds of situations. But if you just simply flip the role and you take what she said and pretend it's the husband that said it, you'd be telling the wife that her husband was a jerk. But if it's a woman, she's going to get away with it for a much longer time. So I think it would be helpful for you to kind of come up with what it looks like. You, Todd, not you, ambiguous you. Come up with what it looks like from that side of the table.
We definitely need to approach it, like we've talked about before, is that, yes, it's more on, out in the open, not out in the open, I guess. Obvious that women are the ones usually getting harmed or hurt. And, it's depending on the statistics, about 1 in 4 within religious households. With men, it's about 1 in 9. So it does show up differently. It does look differently. Women, generally speaking, cannot overpower men, at least be a physical threat to men, generally speaking. So you're going to see them show up in different ways. And we'll definitely run through like the 4 main archetypes of bad, like bad female behavior. That's not the right words. Like a toxicity, like feminine toxicity, I guess you could say. How that shows up and how it shows up as abuse, especially with men, and how we're not prepared. We're not wired to handle it. By the way, like men getting abused by a woman is very disorienting, very, very difficult to manage and negotiate, especially if you're not, you don't have like violent propensities to you, as it is. Like you want to get along, you want things to work out. It's like, well, what do I do? Am I being abused? Like I don't feel like I am. Like I always joke around, I guess with myself, all my scars are on the inside. Yay, psychological trauma, versus like, having my dad, slap me around or something like that. It takes time. It takes awareness. And once you see it, you see it. So we'll definitely cover that stuff. On that note, thanks for spending time with us today. We really do appreciate it. Of course, if you want to reach out to Laura or myself, you can do that by hitting up the old Gmails at naughtyversus, VERSUS, nice at gmail.com. Bounce on over to buymeacupofcoffee.com.
Buy me a coffee.
Buymeacoffee.com
/.
Is it forward or back?
It's forward.
Have I been saying it wrong the whole time?
You can just say /.
Hold on, I'm doing this. I can do it. I can do it. Take 3. Or bounce on over to buymeacoffee.com /naughtyversusnice. You'll find additional commentary from Laura and myself regarding the episode and additional resources also. Thank you very much, and we'll talk at you next time.